What's up, heathens? How ya doing? So today we're going to be taking a look at a segment of the cross-examination between me and Jonathan McLatchie. If you guys didn't know, I posted the main part of that debate last week, so there will be a card and a link in the description if you want to go and see the main portion of the debate. What we're going through here is analyzing the cross-examination portion of it because they were broken up into 10-minute segments where each one of us was able to question the other person about their particular stance. Today what we're going to be talking about is the Luke Acts argument, basically saying that Luke Acts dates much earlier than all other historians date it to be, and also the evidence in Luke Acts that seems to indicate that it was written by eyewitnesses. That's what we're going to be going over today. If you're interested in this, please stay tuned. So before we begin today's video, I wanted to give last month's shoutouts to the Globeheads and Free Thinkers. First, we'll start off with the Globeheads. I'd like to give a personal thank you to the Clyde 950, Ulterior Motifs, Paul Reap, Arduin, Cadence, Stellar Monstrosity, Christina Webster, and Sean J. You guys are awesome Globeheads, and I'm so thankful to have you guys supporting me. And now for the pure free thinkers out there, I really appreciate you guys supporting the channel here. Jonathan Hanachak, Uhan Roderick, Paul Barrett, The Random Explorer, Hoosier Atheist, and Drew's Book Reviews. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for helping me do what I do. Alright, so first what we're going to do is take a look at this particular part of the cross-examination, and then I want to follow it up with some more information. So, I hope that you'll enjoy this little snippet of the main debate. Like I said before, all relevant links are going to be in the description, so if you want to see the entire debate, the full 3-hour thing, or if you just want to see the main abridged debate, those links will be down below.
John, thanks for your statements. Would you concede that the author of Luke Acts believed that Jesus was a physical person who walked on earth?
I mean, with the consideration that 2 Gospels were written before him claiming so, and he was using those, I would say that the author of Luke's, whoever that might be, would probably consider Jesus to be a historical person.
Probably. You mean certainly?
No, I'm not going to say certainly. I'm going to say probably, because I don't, like, as far as history goes, I don't really deal with certainties. Like, I'm not 100% certain or anything like that. I say probably just because that's the most probable, explanation.
But you would acknowledge that the evidence is overwhelming that Luke thought Jesus was a physical person who walked on earth, right?
Sure.
Yeah. And if hypothetically Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, that would disintegrate Carrier's thesis, would it not?
If Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, I don't think that would necessarily, because a lot of Luke's teachings kind of contradict what Paul writes about. Like,
okay, no, that's a separate question. So we can debate whether Luke really was a traveling companion of Paul, but if he was, then it would be very surprising for Luke to think Jesus was a historical person who walked on earth and Paul to have thought otherwise.
I think that if Luke, the person that we're calling Luke, actually was a traveling companion of Paul, I think that we would find Luke being written much earlier than we actually do.
I mean, Luke, I think, is very early. I mean, I would place the Gospel of Luke in the 50s.
Why would you do that?
Well, I'm non-committal on it because I don't think it's hugely important. I certainly don't think it's as late as Carrier and yourself want to date it to the 90s. But I mean, part of the reason for that is because I date Acts to the early 60s, and Luke obviously has to predate Acts. And also there's a reference to Luke in 1 Timothy 5:18, which I would date to the early 60s. And so that would push Luke back as well.
Wait a second. 1 Corinthians, hold on.
1 Timothy 5:18.
What?
1 Timothy 5:18.
Oh, 1 Timothy. That wasn't written by Paul. So yeah.
So I actually think it was. So that's going to be a bone of contention between us, I think.
Well, yeah, we're going to have to fundamentally disagree on that because if I remember correctly, you think that all of the epistles that are attributed to Paul were actually written by Paul. Whereas that's clearly been shown. And you keep throwing around Richard Carrier's name, which I do draw a lot of my information off of Carrier, but that is not my only source for any of my ideas. Bart Ehrman, I use him for a lot of my sourcing material. Ed Helms is another person. Robert Price is another person. Earl Doherty. I mean, Raphael Lataster. There's a multitude of different people out there that espouse the exact same things.
Well, there's different flavors of mythicism, and Richard Carrier's approach is rather different from Price's, etc. But getting back to the question, so if Luke was Richard Carrier even conceded this in his debate with me, that if Luke really was a traveling companion of Paul, his argument is in serious hot water, because Luke clearly believed that Jesus was a physical person who walked on earth, right?
Well, yeah, but I don't think that speculating about Luke being a traveling companion of Paul.
It's not speculation, it's overwhelming evidence for it.
Gets us anywhere.
It's not speculation, it's overwhelming evidence.
I don't think that there is overwhelming evidence, because, good.
For example, the we passages starting from Acts 16, I think are strong evidence that Luke claims to be a traveling companion of Paul. So then we can go and evaluate whether he's actually credible in that claim. In Acts 16, actually, the we passages trail off when they're in Philippi, and then you don't find any more we passages until chapter 20, when they start again when Paul goes back to Philippi, which Craig Keener, in his 4-volume commentary in Acts, in the first volume, he makes a cumulative case for taking the we passages at face value, and that one of the arguments that he makes is that that's exactly the sort of pattern you would expect if Luke, the author, had remained in Philippi and had regrouped with Paul when Paul had gone back through Philippi in chapter 20.
Well, yeah, but if you come at it from the perspective of Acts being historical fiction, like I believe it's Michael Pervo.
Richard Pervo, he's a crank, frankly. Yeah, Richard Pervo and Richard Carrier are both really in a limb when it comes to the Book of Acts.
Okay. The fact of the matter is, though, is that Acts and Luke both pull from sources that only occur much later in the timeline.
No, I don't think that Acts is drawing on Josephus. I think that they're both historians who wrote about. I think they're both contemporaries of each other. And let's just take an example that I think shows just the credibility of Acts. So consider. So this is an example of an undesigned coincidence pertaining to Acts. So in 1 Corinthians 4. So Paul is writing the epistle of 1 Corinthians from Ephesus to the Corinthian Christians, and Ephesus is in Asia Minor and is across the Aegean Sea from Corinth, which is the capital of Achaia, which we named as Greece. And in 1 Corinthians 4, he mentions in verse 17, that's why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ. So at the time he's writing, in the early to mid-50s, to the Corinthians from Ephesus, he's already sent Timothy on his way to Corinth, according to that text. But then in chapter 16, he says, when Timothy comes, Epitome is among you. And so he thus, even though he has already sent Timothy on his way to the Corinthians, he nonetheless expects his letter to arrive in Corinth before Timothy gets there. So how do we put those little puzzle pieces together? Well, if we go over to Acts in chapter 19, when they're in Ephesus, which is when Paul's in Ephesus, verse 21 and 22, it says, now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I've been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So it correlates exactly with what you'd expect from those clues in 1 Corinthians, in a way that points to the authorship of 1 Corinthians, which is not contested, and also points to the historicity of Acts in that particular instance. And there's dozens of those that corroborate Acts.
Well, okay, but I don't understand how you're exactly debunking my particular hypothesis, being that Acts was written much later, and so he was using Paul's writings and Mark's writings and all of that. Why is that?
So he was using So,
Hold on. Why is your particular explanation more probable than the author of Luke just having access to, Paul's writings and reconciling different things or writing his narrative with that in mind? It just seems like he's writing it because he's writing it that way because he has access to that information.
Because these things are so subtle. In First Corinthians, in First Corinthians, these things are buried in First Corinthians 4 and First Corinthians 6 and First Corinthians 16. So it's not like that the author of First Corinthians is using Acts to insert those little details so far apart. And in Acts, there's no mention of even Corinth being the destination of Timothy. It's so casual and subtle. And so by far, the hypothesis that this actually happened is the simplest explanation of the evidence. But it's
simplest explanation though, especially when you consider all of the evidence that places Acts and Luke Acts at the very end of the first century.
No, that's totally not true. I mean, I completely contest that the author of Luke was dependent on Josephus.
Okay, well, I mean, you can contest that, but I mean, there's a plethora of evidence that suggests differently. So, I mean, I guess that's just going to have to be a contention. Like, honestly, I don't think that the whole Acts attack, I guess, like using Acts in order to prove a historical Jesus, I really don't think that that's a very worthwhile thing to go down, because there's much better evidence that we can discuss. Because obviously I don't consider Acts to be written at the time that you consider Acts to be written. And I'm guessing that you consider all the Gospels and everything like that to be written much, much earlier than what the evidence actually suggests, at least in my opinion.
It's you that think that much later than the evidence actually suggests. But I'm non-committal on the actual date of the Gospels, because I think there's a lot of room for debate on the actual dating of the Gospels. But they're certainly written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And I think that they're certainly based on the testimony of eyewitnesses and credible eyewitnesses.
Okay, so there's pretty much like two separate points here that I want to clarify and give you more information on. One of those points is the dating of Luke Acts, and then another one is these we passages that he talks about. Now, there isn't any actual evidence to suggest that Luke Acts was written within the lifetimes of any eyewitnesses that could have existed. This is because there is a significant amount of evidence that points to Luke Acts utilizing not only Josephus, but Homer as well as the Septuagint in order to generate the gospel in Acts. You see, one of the ways that we know that Luke Acts draws from the Septuagint is because there's significant reworkings of the Elisha narrative from the Old Testament. This is most notably proved by Thomas Brodie, who he himself is a Christian, but is also a mythicist. Now, Randall Helms has also used the Septuagint in order to make a connection with Luke Acts, namely the book of Ezekiel. Helms goes on to show that the book of Ezekiel in the Septuagint was used to generate the visions of Cornelius and Peter. Now, while Randall Helms shows us that Ezekiel was used to generate these visions of Cornelius and Peter, the overall structure of that entire segment was actually derived by Homer, and this is proved conclusively by Dennis MacDonald. Also, the fact that Luke Acts heavily uses Josephus to add a lot of historical color to his narrative is well attested by Richard Pervo, Barbara Shellard, Steve Mason, Gregory Sterling, Heinz Schreckenberg, and Max Krenkel. See, all of these historical scholars here support the very fact that Luke Acts uses Josephus in order to create his narrative. So what this means for our dating of Luke is that it places it firmly after 93 CE, when Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews was written. Now, there are some pretty good arguments placing Luke Acts, after 115 CE. But the best that we can really conclude is that Luke Acts was written between 93 CE and 130 CE. If you really want more information about the dating of Luke Acts, especially the late date for Luke Acts, I would highly suggest Richard Pervo's Dating Acts book, as well as MacDonald's Two Shipwrecked Gospels book. They elaborate a lot more on this particular point. You see, McLatchie here seems to think that Pervo and Carrier are out on a limb here, meaning an unstable limb, for dating Luke Acts. But what I find is that they have a well substantiated and supported limb that they are resting on. All right, so next is the we passages, and this is just not a convincing argument whatsoever. Now you see, Dennis MacDonald has shown that Luke Acts heavily relies on Homer's Odyssey when he's generating his shipwreck narratives. And lo and behold, the shipwreck narratives is where we find the we passages cropping up. The reason why this is significant is because we have historical precedents for writing fiction in the first person, like with the Odyssey by Homer, the very thing that Luke is pulling from to generate these shipwreck narratives. Of course, the we passages don't only occur around the shipwrecks, it's pretty much just any kind of sea travel kind of section where these we passages crop up at. But again, like we have shown, I mean, there is historical precedence for using first person to tell a fictional narrative. All in all, this is just not a convincing argument whatsoever. Now, Paul does mention being shipwrecked about 3 times, so it's no wonder that Luke felt like he had to come up with some kind of shipwreck narrative in order to make his gospel seem more plausible. You see, the author of Luke Acts didn't only use Homer's The Odyssey in order to generate his shipwreck narratives. He also used things like Jonah and the Aeneid. So that was just a little bit of extra information that I wasn't able to really get into the debate, or I didn't think about in the debate, or I didn't know in the debate. I did a lot of research after having the debate in order to give you guys the best information that I could. So if you have not seen the original debate, the links are down below in the description. Go down there, check them out. I would really love for you to give me your thoughts on them. While you're down there, though, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.